Hey everybody, welcome to Horror and Homebrew, my YouTube channel. If you are one of my subscribers, you already know that most of what I do here has to do with homebrewing and writing horror. But I'm doing something a little different today, and that is starting with the first step in catching wild yeast for sourdough bread. So this will be the sourdough primer part 1. There will be a few parts to this series as we move from catching wild yeast all the way through the baking of a loaf of sourdough. This is something I've done in the past. It's a lot of fun and of interest, I think, to homebrewers as well as people who are just into baking, or anyone who's interested in science, specifically food science. The reason it would be of interest to homebrewers, I think, is because we're dealing with yeast here, and that's a lot of what we do with homebrew. A lot of you know, if you are a homebrewer, that catching wild yeast in your homebrew is usually something you don't want to do. There are times that you want to make maybe a sour beer, and working with wild yeast at that point becomes of interest to you. But most of the time we're trying to use a particular strain of yeast that we purchase and want to keep confined, and we don't want any wild yeast getting in there. That's usually the case as well when you're baking, right? You buy a pack of yeast and you throw it in with your water and flour and whatever other ingredients you're using for that bread, and that's the yeast that you want in there. What I've learned over the years of baking is that yeast, the stuff that you buy in the store, that comes in a little packet or sometimes in a little jar, it's all one strain of yeast. They produce this yeast to pretty much do two things. Number one, be very active, so create a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of rise, making your bread double in bulk really quickly, right? That's what we all want when we are baking bread. We want it to rise and become doubled in bulk or more. And the second thing is to have a fairly neutral flavor. So that yeasty flavor you sometimes taste in bread, it's usually due to the fact that we're using this very kind of like neutral, singular flavored yeast. What we do when we catch wild yeast is we're imparting new flavors. And specifically, obviously, with sourdough, we're going for kind of a sour or tart flavor with our bread. That's due to two things, actually. One is the fact that we're catching a wild strain of yeast, and the second is lactobacillus. That's a type of bacteria that produces lactic acid. And the lactic acid is, of course, what gives a little bit of that sour flavor to the sourdough. So we have two things working symbiotically together: wild yeast and lactobacillic acid, and or lactobacillic yeast, or bacteria, I should say. So those two things are happening. That's kind of what we're looking for when we do our catching of wild yeast. So in this first video, we're going to go through the process of creating a starter to catch our wild yeast, and then over the course of 5 to 7 days we're going to feed that culture of yeast and bacteria that we catch, and hopefully get a good flavored yeast out of it. Now this is sort of experimental in the sense that you may get a strain that doesn't taste very good or doesn't produce enough carbon dioxide, and in those cases you can just toss the culture and start again, because there's wild yeast floating around here, all different kinds of strains, and you're never really sure what you're going to get. So part of the fun is seeing what will happen when you do this. What kind of flavors are you going to get? What kind of smells are you going to get? One word of caution as we're doing this: it can mold. Now, what we hope is that the yeast and bacteria, the good yeast and bacteria that we want, take hold first and start creating that lactic acid, which then makes a bad environment for bad bacteria and mold, but a good environment for our yeast and good bacteria. That's what we're hoping for, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes if something spoils before the good yeast and good bacteria get in there, that's dangerous. So as we're going through this, if you are following along and you find that there's mold on your culture, or it smells really bad in a spoiled way, you want to toss that out and start again. And as we go through the series, of course, I'll show you what a good culture is going to look like, what good smells are that you're looking for. For this first step, simply all you need is a container for the starter. I like to use a mason jar. You can use any glass bowl, Tupperware. You probably want to avoid metal. Try to stick to glass or plastic. I prefer glass. So you need the container. You need a cup of water. You need a cup of flour. So it's going to be equal parts water and flour. Some people like to play around with the measurements there, put a little more flour than water. And you can do that if you like, but I like to just go equal parts because it's easier. The flour I'm using today is going to be a white whole wheat flour, so half a cup of white whole wheat flour, organic, King Arthur flour, and half a cup of just standard unbleached white flour. So that'll be a full cup of flour, half a cup of each. You can use a full cup of white flour. You could use regular wheat flour mixed with the white flour. You could use rye flour mixed with the white flour. A lot of people prefer to use rye, and if I had it on hand, I probably would use rye instead of the whole wheat. Rye has a little more good bacteria already kind of mixed in there, so a lot of times that produces a better culture quicker. So if you have the rye flour, I'd go with that. And then you also will need something to stir with, and utensils. If you're a home brewer and you want to sanitize your vessel with Star San, you can do that. Otherwise, you can just clean everything out, make sure it's real clean, not dirty. Doesn't necessarily have to be sanitized because we are going for some wild stuff here. In the flour, there's going to be different bacteria and yeast. In the air, there's going to be different bacteria and yeast. And we're just kind of hoping for anything, right? We want something to catch hold of this and start to produce, and hopefully it'll be good yeast and bacteria. Okay, so simply to get started, this is what we do. Okay, on the table you'll see that I have my mason jar, and it's already filled with some water. That's 1 cup of water. And all I'm doing here now is moving my flour mixture, which again is half a cup of the whole wheat white flour unbleached and half a cup of the unbleached white flour. I'm just going to get that all into my vessel. Okay. Now once you have the water and flour mixed together, or in the same vessel, you want to mix that together. I could use this knife, but what I'm going to try doing first is actually just shaking it up. Now the reason I'm doing this partly is because I also want there to be a lot of air in it. This is a lot like when you are whipping air into, if you make beer, and you're whipping air into your wort after you put the yeast in. Aeration, of course, is going to help with the yeast. They like oxygen to help them produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. And we are going to get a little bit of alcohol out of this. I'll show you what that looks like as we move forward. But the alcohol part of it, oftentimes in the sourdough community, call it hooch or liquor, is going to be an off-white, kind of brownish liquid that collects at the top, and it's going to be very sour. It's mostly lactic acid with a little alcohol mixed in, and you'll see what that looks like. Now, I want to clean the sides of this off a little bit because I want to be able to tell the level of the starter now, because once good yeast takes hold, it's going to double in bulk or produce carbon dioxide and start rising. So I want to be able to tell where that happens. I don't want this all to dry on there. So I'm going to get a little spatula and just kind of rub down the sides and make sure it's clean. Okay, so I have a little rubber spatula here, and I'm just going to kind of scoop down the sides a little bit, get it a little clean. If you prefer not to use a mason jar for this, or if you have one of those wide mouth mason jars, that would be even better. You could absolutely do this in a bowl, or pretty much any vessel that you think is easy. I like to do it in the mason jar just because I'm going to leave this in the mason jar as we move forward and actually use this as my main sourdough collection vessel. The reason for that is as we move forward here with our sourdough, what you're going to find is as the days go on, we want to feed our yeast. So after a day or two passes and we start noticing that there is activity in our vessel, we then want to make sure that there's enough food for our yeast, and we'll add more water and flour at that point. And a lot of times we'll also kind of take out a portion of the culture to make room for the new food. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm gonna leave it there. Now, as you can see, we're gonna mark off where our culture is starting. Our culture is starting at about, I'd call that a little below 1.5 cups. So we have about 1.5 cups of starter in there. You can see that it's like a pancake batter consistency. If you want a thicker starter, some people do put more flour, less water. Okay. The final step here in our first stage of yeast collection is we want to make sure yeast can get in there. So you want to cover this loosely with either a dish towel or cheesecloth is my preferred method. I don't have either of those on hand right now, so what I'm using is a coffee filter that I'm just going to kind of loosely place on top here. I'll put my little ring just to hold it. You know, I'm not screwing it down tight or anything, just kind of holding it on there. And that is it. We have our starter, 1.5 cups, and we're going to wait and see if any wild yeast produce. Now that we have our starter all set in our vessel with a loosely covered top, again cheesecloth, filter, dish towel, you want to put that in a warm place, 80-85 degrees. I'm going to actually leave mine outside. There's a lot of wind blowing around out here, and hopefully some good wild yeast are going to catch. You don't have to leave it outside, you can put it indoors. You probably don't want to leave it in severe heat, you don't want to leave it in direct sun. Leaving it outside is a little bit of a risk because of bugs and things, but this is covered, so we should be okay. If you want, you could just put it indoors somewhere. There's plenty of yeast inside too. You don't have to like have a huge wind blowing around. So we're going to let that go for about 24 hours, and we'll check in on it later and see if we have any activity. And at that point, we could feed our culture and let it go for another 12 to 24 hours before feeding it again. And we just keep checking it. We want to make sure that no bad bacteria have taken hold. We want to make sure there's no mold, and we'll see if there's anything happening in there. One final word about the yeast. Depending on the region that you're in, everyone has different wild yeast floating around. So what I make here is not going to be the same flavor, the same activity as something you might catch, say, in California. So that's another part of like the fun of this. So anyway, that is part one of the creation of our starter. I'm going to come back with the daily check-in of our starter to see if there's any activity, and then we'll finish up with using our new sourdough yeast starter to make some good bread. See you next time.